Madeleine McCann was just 9 days away from her 4th birthday when she was reported missing during a Portuguese holiday in 2007. In the last decade, Madeleine has become the world's most famous missing person, with her case receiving unprecedented police time and public funds in 2 countries. Add to this accusations of police favouritism and leniency towards Madeleine's parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, and this story becomes a significant talking point for millions of people. I'm Sonia Poulton, journalist and broadcaster, and I've been intrigued by the Mccanns' relationship with the police from the very beginning. In this film, I look at the extraordinary steps some officers, past and present, have been prepared to take with this case, and I ask, why have British police insisted on focusing only on abduction from the beginning, and is that likely to change? The story of Madeleine McCann is an enduring one. Since the disappearance of the 3-year-old British girl in 2007 during a Portuguese holiday, the mystery has taken on a life of global interest and extraordinary significance. There are very few stories capable of capturing the public imagination in the way that Madeleine's disappearance has, and certainly in over 2 decades of my work in the media, I can only recall a handful of events that have struck a chord in such a phenomenal manner.
Suddenly the news of missing Madeleine was global. Everybody knew about it and everybody was following the case. If I remember rightly, Sky News actually devoted a channel to the McCanns where we were getting literally rolling news and updates constantly.
Breaking news for you this morning. We're just hearing that a search is underway for a 3-year-old British girl who's gone missing in the Algarve area of Portugal, and she went missing last night. Hundreds of people have been searching for the girl, and that search continuing this morning.
Praia da Luz, a whitewashed village on the Portuguese Algarve, known to some as Little England for the amount of expats who settled here. But in May 2007, little did the villagers know that their idyllic and peaceful existence would be changed beyond all recognition. It was here that the McCanns and their 3 young children arrived with a group of friends to enjoy their spring break. The trip was organised by the McCanns' friend, Dr. David Payne. His wife Fiona had met Kate McCann 7 years before in 2000 while working at a Leicester hospital. The Paynes' 2 young daughters played with the McCanns' 3 small children. The Paynes were the common thread between all the couples on that fateful holiday, including Dr. Russell O'Brien and his partner Jane Tanner and their 2 young daughters. Also on the trip was Dr. Matthew Oldfield, his wife Rachel and their toddler daughter. A late addition to the holiday party was Fiona Payne's mother Diane Webster. Of the 9 children, Madeleine at the age of 3 was the oldest, and of the 9 adults, 6 of them were doctors. So it was on the morning of Saturday, April the 28th, 2007, the McCanns and their holidaying friends flew from England to Portugal and arrived at the destination that would see their lives changed forever. It was here at the Ocean Club in Praia da Luz where Kate and Gerry McCann and their 7 holidaying companions came nightly to dine at the tapas bar, and it was from here that they had established their somewhat questionable babysitting routine. In the 10 years since Madeleine became the world's most famous missing person, observers then and now objected to what they deemed as neglect at the hands of the holidaying adults. For while the adults socialised during dinner, their young children were left unattended in their holiday flats with, we are told, half-hourly check-ins on the sleeping children. This, they told police, had been going on for 4 nights prior to Madeleine being reported missing by her mum, Kate McCann. The McCann family and friends were quick to deny any accusations and neglect, describing their actions as well within the bounds of responsible parenting. This was Gerry McCann's sister just 2 days after Madeleine was reported missing.
The childcare facilities, you're leaving people with other folk that you don't know. Gerry and Kate are in a clear line of sight of their kids. They regularly go across to check maybe if the kids have been disturbed or crying or anything, to suggest in any possible way that Kate and Gerry are negligent parents, is just abhorrent to all of us. They love their family. They would never willingly, knowingly or in any way neglect them.
Others disagreed, but perhaps this woman back in the McCanns village in Leicester captured that mood best.
Oh, I just don't like, I think the McCanns are hypocrites and the people are openly are hypocrites.
Why so?
Why? Because at the end of the day, if it was people on council estates, we'd get our children taken off of us. They're doctors, they should show an example. They went on holiday, they've got a big house, they've got money. At the end of the day, why didn't they pay for babysitting facilities or take a nanny with them? They wanted to go on holiday with the children, they shouldn't go out and leave them.
So do you think if this were you, you'd be in jail by now?
I probably would have. I'll have rung social services up. And Peter McIntyre from social services in Leicester said if it was my children, they'd be placed on the at-risk register and taken away. Why not the McCanns?
Working in mainstream media in England, I discovered that many of my colleagues also left young children in hotel rooms and apartments while on holiday. For me, it went some way to explaining some of the sympathetic tone that columnists adopted when describing the McCanns' dilemma. Even Kate McCann noticed it. She wrote about journalists in Prada-Luz in the early days having a there but for the grace of God go I attitude towards her. But there were many people who were horrified at leaving young children alone. And over the last decade, there have been several petitions calling for the McCanns to be prosecuted for neglect. None have amounted to further action. For many, the question remains, why weren't the McCanns and their friends prosecuted for leaving their children alone when one had clearly come to harm?
Neglect is the most common form of child abuse and boils down quite simply to parent or caregiver failing to protect a child from the dangers of physical or emotional trauma. One of the qualifying factors in evidencing neglect is that of supervision, or more importantly, the lack of supervision. In the case of the McCanns, they admitted that they had left their children unsupervised on numerous occasions during the course of the week. And it was during one of these periods where the children weren't supervised that Madeleine and her siblings were placed in a position of danger. And in fact, Madeleine, it would appear, has either suffered some level of physical and or emotional trauma, almost certainly emotional trauma. I can understand that given the definition of neglect, given the circumstances, there are many people that would want to ask the question, why weren't the McCanns investigated and pursued for an allegation of neglect?
Former Portuguese Minister Rui Pereira later said the McCanns had not been charged because there was compassion towards the couple. He said the action of leaving children alone while on holiday was believed to be a British custom. Millions of Brits begged to differ. Online, where Madeleine's case has been passionately debated for the last decade, there exists a belief amongst some that the children were actually never left alone, that the issue of neglect is an alibi for something far more sinister. As Gerry McCann himself had said, he doesn't have a problem with people purporting a theory about his missing daughter, and they are wrong or right. Madeleine stayed in this ground floor block with her parents Kate and Gerry and her younger twin siblings Sean and Amelie. The McCanns' friends also had apartments in the same building. Her parents initially said she'd been abducted through this window, and while they dined in front of this whitewashed block, family and friends also conveyed that to the media.
It is obvious that someone with malicious intent went through that window and took Madeleine from the safety and security of her family.
But the Portuguese police and the manager of the holiday resort said there was no evidence of a break-in, and the only fingerprints on the window, which had been cleaned the day before, belonged to Kate McCann. And so the latter version of how an abductor may have accessed the apartment was through the patio door, which it turned out was left unlocked by the McCanns for easy access. It's just at the top of this gate and slightly uphill from the tapas bar. Just hours after Madeleine's reported disappearance, British Ambassador to Portugal John Buck was on hand to assist the McCanns. His presence, as Portuguese police later noted, was to create all manner of political issues between the UK and Portugal, but his involvement was merely the tip of the political iceberg. Within weeks of Madeleine's reported disappearance, British Chancellor Gordon Brown, who was little over a month away from becoming Prime Minister, had personally reassured the McCanns of his support during a telephone conversation. To date, 4 British Prime Ministers have supported the case above and beyond the help given to other missing person cases, more of which later. The McCanns' relationship with police has been an interesting one to observe. There's been accusations of British police favouritism towards the 2 middle-class doctors. In fact, just weeks after Madeleine's reported disappearance, Gerry McCann attended a lavish Police Bravery Awards dinner in London and was rewarded with a standing ovation. Considering he was surrounded by policemen and women who had risked their lives in the line of duty, it was, an attendee later confided, bizarre to see this response to a man who had yet to be ruled out of the involvement of his daughter's disappearance. But let's go back. Operation Task, the initial investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine, would become the biggest manhunt in Portugal's history, as officers cancelled their annual holidays to search for the British child. It was here that the McCanns would meet Gonzalo Amaral, the police chief, who would come to be their enemy. The Portuguese police was subject to immense criticism from British media, police, the McCanns and their friends, and the first criticism came just within hours of Madeleine's reported disappearance. This was from the McCann's medic friend Jill Rennick, who called a British TV breakfast show after talking with Kate. During the TV conversation, Rennick repeated the claim that an abductor had forced entry into the apartment by coming in through the McCann's window. Rennick's involvement in the story, albeit brief, set a foundation of how millions of people viewed the case, and Rennick was equally as potent in denouncing the Portuguese police.
They're just having to wait till people help them. They've been looking themselves. They walked along the hedgerows and they've been out shouting, but there's nothing else they can do unless they get support from the police over there or the police here.
Jill Rennick, it turned out, had an interesting neighbour, Andrew Brown, brother of the soon-to-be Prime Minister Gordon, and Rennick later recalled how she stopped Andrew in the street and asked if he could get his brother to help. It's the curious synchronicities like this which have contributed to the intense and enduring interest in Madeleine's story. For those on the ground who had searched until the early hours, including holiday centre staff, tourists and police, Jill Rennick's assessment was considered harsh. But Rennick was only the beginning of the criticism of the Portuguese police, also known as the PJ. In the UK, there has been no shortage of politicians, journalists and former cops lining up to lay the boot into the Portuguese police.
It was quite clear from the start that the Portuguese police took off on the wrong tack. They believed that this was a matter within the family, and the punishment that they put the poor parents through is just unbelievable.
But was that true? Operation Task, led by Gonzalo Amaral, had made a number of unprecedented compromises for the McCanns, including allowing Gerry to sit in on a police interview with Kate and permitting the McCanns and their friends to keep the media informed, albeit begrudgingly. This action was contrary to Portugal's judicial secrecy laws, which govern live investigations. In addition, unprecedented numbers of police were drafted in from all over Portugal, and within days, hundreds were on the case. There were accusations of leaks to the press from both the McCanns and the Portuguese police. Certainly, during a vital stage of the investigation and during the time Kate was being interviewed at Portimao police station, she had been texting updates to the outside world, again contrary to Portuguese law, and as a press spokeswoman later admitted, a bit naughty. But there were other criticisms of the Portuguese police. They were accused of not adequately preserving the crime scene, and there was some truth in this, as it took until the next morning to properly do so. But here they had some challenges too. By the time the police arrived, the McCanns and their friends had already been through the holiday apartment, potentially destroying valuable forensic evidence. Certainly the Portuguese police made rookie errors, but so, it would appear, did 6 doctors. Nonetheless, by the end of summer 2007, and certainly by the time he'd made Kate and Gerry McCann official suspects, or arguido in Portuguese, Amaral's relationship with the McCanns had completely deteriorated, and on his birthday in October he was removed from the case. He was quoted in a newspaper criticising his UK counterparts, the police from the McCanns' home back in England. He suggested that Leicester police were only interested in pursuing what the McCanns wanted pursued, and they were failing to treat the couple as suspects. Dr. Amaral later claimed that Gordon Brown knew about his removal and demotion before he did. I contacted Gordon Brown's office to put this and other questions to him. He chose not to respond. Gordon Brown is a frequent name to emerge in the early days of Madeleine's reported disappearance. Here he is, in September 2007, with his Home Secretary Jackie Smith. They're visiting Leicester Police. This was just days after Kate and Gerry McCann had been made official suspects and had returned to England. Officially, Brown and Smith had come to talk neighbourhood watch schemes, but did this visit also cement how Madeleine's case would be treated by British police? the then Labour government refused to confirm or deny if Brown had discussed the McCanns or Madeleine with Leicester police chiefs. I've been to Pradeluz a couple of times. Madeleine's story is still discussed in the supermarkets and on the beach, but most people refuse to express their sentiments to camera, except Pedro. We met him on the seafront, son of a Portuguese policeman. He was collecting change for a children's charity. He was prepared to say his piece to camera.
The politics that was going by after the case wasn't adding up to the criminal investigation that was going by. And it's a shame because after 10 years, the case always makes some way of shivering people in Portugal, because it's one of the cases that did most influence. It was the most influence from the politics and the media.
Leicester is just over 100 miles north of London, and within days of Madeleine's reported disappearance, family liaison officers from the McCanns' home had arrived in Pradeluz. Leicester police officers followed, and they had come, according to Gonzalo Amaral, to exonerate the McCanns from any wrongdoing. Interestingly, it seems this is not how the McCanns saw their local police force. I've seen a restricted document that was prepared for the British Home Office. Revealingly, it outlines much of how Kate and Gerry felt about their police relations. It said they believed the Portuguese investigation was flawed from the beginning, that there were problems between Portuguese and British police, and that Kate and Gerry distrusted Leicester police. It paints a picture of a great deal of dissatisfaction on behalf of the McCanns, and comes over at times as if the report is speaking on behalf of the two doctors, rather than remaining more neutral, as perhaps an official document for government should do. Despite being pushed out from the investigation, Gonzalo Amaral released a book a year later in 2008 in which he outlined his belief that Madeleine had accidentally died in apartment 5A and her parents had faked an abduction. A documentary based on the book was released in Portuguese. Thus began a protracted libel case between the McCanns and their daughter's former police investigator. Amaral's assets were frozen, his marriage fell apart, and he became a shadow of his former sociable self. The case dragged on for 7 years. The McCanns initially won, then lost on appeal. Kate McCann had never hidden her loathing of the detective and had written in her book that he deserves to be miserable and feel fear. Throughout the trial, the McCanns maintained that Amaral had harmed the search for Madeleine.
And we believe that Mr. Amaral is trying to stop her that human right of being looked for and found.
So, was Dr. Amaral a malicious monster as he's been portrayed by British media? Not according to his fans, police and public alike. I've talked with Metropolitan Police officers who expressed solidarity with Gonzalo Amaral. A number of them even contributed to a fundraiser for his legal fees, defending the McCanns' case against him. Interestingly, Kate McCann also had a fundraiser running at the same time, but was some 20,000 behind her nemesis. British media dubbed Amaral contributors as trolls. I've talked to some donators and they are proud to contribute to what they see as an injustice against the ex-police chief. This woman is one of them.
I've read all of the PJ files and I'm not buying the McFable.
The Portuguese police case was archived in 2008 as a consequence of lack of evidence. With it went Kate and Gerry McCann's aguido status, although they were never formally cleared by the original investigation. During the summing up of the McCanns' libel trial with Gonzalo Amaral, the Supreme Court judges clarified this position. In keeping with Portuguese law, the witness statements and case documents were put online. I talked with Pat Brown, a profiler from America who has written a book about Madeleine's disappearance.
And then, of course, the police files came out, and that's what rocked my world when it came down to what I thought happened in this case, because there was no way to deny that once one read the police files, that there was no evidence of an abduction. And the statements that were given by the McCanns and their friends put a lot of question marks out there. And so immediately when I read them, I said, this is exactly why Detective Amaral began to believe that the parents might have had some involvement in the disappearance of their daughter, and this is why the police started focusing in on the McCanns. So I think that anybody who has read the police files, and many, many people have now, can come to a conclusion that there is good reason that the McCanns should be suspects. And that is the conclusion I came to, that they should be suspects.
For a time, the publicly funded Find Madeleine Fund employed a series of private detectives, some of them highly questionable, but it came to nothing. 1 month before the PJ files were released online, Leicester Police agreed to disclose 80 pieces of investigation information to the McCanns, who had taken their demand to the High Court and said they needed this information for their own private investigators. This was extraordinary capitulation, as the McCanns were still suspects and could have been handed vital information that would help their defence. Mrs. Justice Hogg presiding said she had not asked for the McCanns to attend because they have suffered enough and I wish to ease their burden. Justice Hogg would later become notorious as the judge who returned British schoolgirl Ellie Butler to her father, despite pleas from social services and Ellie's grandparents not to. Ben Butler later murdered 6-year-old Ellie. The McCanns have denied accusations that they failed to cooperate with Portuguese police. However, it was clear there was a discrepancy between what the Portuguese police said and what the McCanns said.
It was here at the police station in Portimao where Kate McCann refused to answer 48 police questions. She did, however, answer the final one.
Over the years, the McCanns have been accused of having friends in high places, and it's easy to see why. Certainly, there's been no shortage of influential people who have been prepared to go the extra mile for the two doctors. And the chief executive of Rupert Murdoch's British media arm was one of them. In 2011, Rebecca Brooks negotiated to serialise Kate McCann's book Madeleine, and Brooks, as was later revealed during a government inquiry into press ethics, was highly instrumental in the launch of Operation Grange, the British police review of the much maligned Portuguese police investigation. Brooks, at the request of Kate and Gerry McCann, had managed to persuade her good friend and Prime Minister, David Cameron, to agree to government funding for it. Within a day of running an open letter from the McCanns on the front page of The Sun, Britain's #1 selling daily newspaper, Operation Grange was given the go-ahead.
Your intervention was successful in securing a review of the case. Do you understand that?
You asked if it was successful and he says it was, yes.
Yes.
Kate and Gerry McCann's request to review the Portuguese investigation had been an understandable one. The PJ had been unable to reach a definitive conclusion, and the McCanns had not been cleared of any involvement in their daughter's disappearance. Their supporters said this also hampered the search for Madeleine. It was apparent that both Kate and Gerry were intent on moving forward, and British police needed to clear any lingering doubts about them once and for all. The McCanns were already making headway in public life, and within months of Madeleine's disappearance, they had entered the European Parliament to call for cross-border cooperation for a child alert system. Kate and Gerry McCann and the fear that their story generated in parents had become useful tools for the Labour government, who sought to extend data gathering throughout Europe. In the following years, the McCanns would become even more involved with public life, as Gerry took to the role of speaking out against the press with the pressure group Hacked Off, and Kate became ambassador for the charity Missing People.
Having Kate McCann as a charity ambassador to missing people was always going to be a controversial choice.
And so the McCanns got what they wanted, and Operation Grange began as a review of the Portuguese police work in 2011. Few foresaw that Madeleine's hunt would become a live murder investigation in 2013.
It's inside this building, Belgravia Police Station in central London, where Operation Grange is housed.
Just months after the review began, this man was approved to the role of overseeing Operation Grange in his position of Commissioner of the Metropolis, the most powerful policeman in England and Wales. Bernhard Howe was no stranger to the McCanns or Madeleine's fundraiser. Just a month after Madeleine's reported disappearance, Howe, then Chief Constable of Merseyside Police, sold helium balloons with the money going to the Find Madeleine campaign, a limited company, not a charity, which has collected millions in public donations since the beginning and can be spent how Kate and Gerry deem appropriate. Flogging balloons on a hillside was an unusual act from a police chief, but Kate McCann had local ties with the area and had grown up in Liverpool. 4 years later, in 2011, Bernhard Hogan would play a much larger role in Madeleine's story, where he oversaw Operation Grange almost from the beginning. In 2016, he told a radio host that Operation Grange was on one final line of inquiry and he intended to see it through. That didn't happen. A year later, having been knighted, he retired. Distinguished retired Metropolitan Police Detective Colin Sutton has been responsible for bringing a number of high-profile perpetrators to justice, including Levi Belfield, who murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler. A newspaper reported that Colin was in the running to lead Operation Grange, but he'd retired by the time it was given the final go-ahead.
I got a phone call from a friend of mine who was a very senior Metropolitan Police officer, and I was told, don't do it. You know, if the newspaper report was true and you are going to be asked to investigate this, don't do it. And the reason I was given was that I would not be happy mounting an investigation, leading an investigation where I was told where I could and where I couldn't go, what I could look at, what I couldn't look at. And my friend knew that I would find that frustrating and I'd probably kick against that, and I'd want to do it properly. I'd want to do a proper reinvestigation looking across the piece to all the possibilities. And it seems that he knew that I wouldn't be able to do that if I took it on.
How did you interpret that?
I certainly interpreted that at the time as being that there was no question of looking at any question of guilt on the part of Kate and Gerry McCann.
As if echoing what Colin Sutton had already been told, DCI Andy Redwood, who was eventually chosen to lead Operation Grange, made an announcement at the start of the investigation.
Neither her parents or any of the members of the group that were with her are either persons of interest or suspects.
To start an investigation and say we're not looking at the parents means that you aren't actually doing a proper investigation, because you start at ground zero when you do a proper investigation or a proper review. You start with the evidence. You go back to the crime scene. You go back to day one. And you review everything, including the family, because that's what you do. And if nothing else more than to properly eliminate them. But you don't start by saying, we've already eliminated these people as suspects before we even do any work. That, to me, reeks of a plan of action before the investigation even starts.
But there's also division within British police ranks about this case. I've seen firsthand how divided some British officers are. I was given access to a secret police group on Facebook. It was a chatty group where serving officers, past and present, came together to share their opinions in ways that they couldn't publicly. There were a number of posts about Madeleine's case. In the time that I was watching, there were several explosive discussions, but one in particular stood out. A serving officer wrote a critical post about Operation Grange. Within seconds of posting, people were responding thick and fast, many agreeing with him and angry at the apparent favouritism shown towards Kate and Gerry McCann. On that thread was an example of what many now know to be a certain censorship around this case. Another policeman wrote that he was so disgusted with what police officers were writing about the force and about the grieving parents, and he would be reporting all such comments to the police complaints the following day. So let me get this straight. A secret group designed to allow police officers to share experiences and vent was subject to threats about the private opinions they posted about Kate and Gerry McCann and the police investigation. It was chilling to observe. When Operation Grange moved from review to investigation, it crucially ruled out the EFIT of the man who had been prime suspect since Madeleine had been reported missing back in 2007. Despite this, it still featured on the official Find Madeleine website 5 years later, even though the man had been eliminated and replaced with another man's EFIT. This one, seen by an Irish family holidaying in Praia-da-Luz at the time of Madeleine's reported disappearance. This EFIT had emerged was not new at all. In fact, it had been drawn up 5 years before by private investigators employed by the Find Madeleine Fund.
Now that sighting has been dogged by controversy ever since.
Members of the Smith family were holidaying at their Portuguese holiday home that May. They enjoyed a drink at Kelly's Bar, roughly 6 minutes' walk from the McCanns' apartment, and left just before 10 p.m. They proceeded up the steps that would lead them to the sighting of an adult man carrying a young girl. The Smith family gave their first police statements in May, just weeks after Madeleine was reported missing. They record seeing a man running down this street with a small girl in his arms. It was around the time that Kate McCann had raised the alarm that Madeleine was missing. 4 months later, after watching Kate and Gerry McCann return to the UK, Martin Smith contacted police again. The image of Gerry descending down the plane steps had triggered something in him. He said that he was now 60 to 80% certain that the man he saw on May the 3rd was Gerry McCann. In the intervening years, there's been much said about this claim. Indeed, during the BBC's 10th year anniversary documentary into Madeleine's disappearance, the reporter said that Mr. Smith had since denied the description. Investigative journalist Gemma O'Doherty recently talked with Martin Smith, and during which he denied the BBC story. Mr. Smith said he'd stood by his belief that the man he saw on that fateful night carrying a child could indeed be Gerry McCann. During the 7-year involvement of British police, officers from Operation Grange have returned to the Algarve for a number of times and have been subject to criticism for doing so. International press mocked it as theatre, and British media questioned how much such a jolly, as they framed it, was costing hard-pressed taxpayers, and at a time of austerity. In 2017, to mark the 10th anniversary since Madeleine was reported missing, Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley, the second most senior cop overseeing the British police investigation, reiterated that the McCanns had not been investigated by Operation Grange.
The parents' involvement, that was dealt with at the time by the original investigation by the Portuguese. So all the material, we're happy that's completely dealt with.
I don't understand the logic of what's been said about this elimination question. The Portuguese authorities are quite clear. They're saying, we have not eliminated Kate and Gerry McCann as suspects. That's their finding.
In October 2013, and citing new lines of inquiry, the Portuguese police reopened their investigation and planned to work with the British police, while the PJ retained lead on the case. But is it possible that both Portuguese and British police inquiries have been too narrow since the departure of Gonzalo Amaral? So when did British police start saying that Madeleine was abducted? The A word, it appears, was called just days after her disappearance, and it would appear that British police never diverted from this way of thinking.
Yeah, I can't tell you why abduction was the only thing that was pursued, but I can certainly say that from what I've seen, from what I know, that appears to be the case, because not only did I get the warning off, but I've subsequently looked at the terms of reference for Operation Grange, which talk about abduction. But perhaps even more tellingly, in the CEOPS report, which really was the basis for setting up Operation Grange, it goes through the chronology of what's gone on in terms of British support for the Portuguese and the British sort of law enforcement response. And we can see that when the first Gold Steering Group was formed, which was on the 8th of May, so it's 5 days after Madeleine went missing, they are already at that point using the word abduction, talking about supporting the Portuguese investigation into the abduction. So it seems to me that there was a mindset that was taken on at a very early stage in this investigation, and which has persisted all the way through up to the current time with Operation Grange.
She wasn't old enough to make a decision to set off and start her own life. However she left that apartment, she's been abducted.
Now what I take that to mean is, because we know that at the time we are told Madeleine McCann went missing from flat 5A, we know her parents and their friends weren't in that flat with them at the time. Therefore, they could not have taken her, or they're not suspects. That doesn't follow, does it? I mean, that's not logical. That's not a kind of forensic way of looking at it, because that's based on some pretty huge assumptions.
So what more, potentially, could the McCanns and their friends have done to help the search for Madeleine?
Certainly, an intense source of criticism has been the lack of a police reconstruction of that fateful holiday in Portugal, a decision influenced by the McCann's friends who refused to take part. As with so much of this case, these actions appear unprecedented. How were potential suspects, statistically speaking, by their sheer proximity to missing Madeleine, able to guide aspects of the investigation?
Reconstructions can assist in the investigation of major crime. They allow investigating officers to see a timeline. They allow investigating officers to compare witness testimonies to the events as they unfolded. It allows them to identify anomalies and discrepancies. Anomalies and discrepancies that I have to say are not necessarily untruths. They're just a consequence of people's perception when they witness something. People very frequently are unsure of times. They misjudge distances. They have difficulty describing accurately people that they haven't seen before and have only seen for a short period of time. And additionally, it allows people that may have seen a small percentage of the overall activity. Now, they may believe that their evidence and what they saw is inconsequential, but when placed together with the evidence of multiple other people, it does help put a jigsaw together and aid in the investigation.
I've been in touch with the people close to the original Portuguese investigation. They gave me drawings and information of what a reconstruction timeline might look like, according to the statements of the McCanns and their 7 friends. 10 years on, there remains clear disparities as to the individual movements on that fateful night, disparities that a reconstruction could have ironed out. The only reconstruction the McCanns and their friends agreed to was for a TV documentary. It was guided by private detectives employed by the McCanns from Madeleine's fund. The TV reconstruction did indeed reveal significant inconsistencies. They focused on this area just outside the McCanns' holiday apartment, and when Gerry McCann met Jeremy Jez Wilkins, a TV producer from London who was holidaying in Portugal at the same time as the McCanns and had played tennis with Gerry. It was here, during one of Jerry's checks on the children at about 9:15 p.m, that he bumped into Jeremy Wilkins.
See, I think you were about here. And I think you were standing like that, and Jez was there with his pram pointing down that way. Because I think if you'd have been looking at me, because I would have said something, because I would have said about, because Kate had been moaning that you'd been gone a long time watching the football.
I'm almost certain that when I came out, I came over and he was here, and I was like that. That's my memory of it, is like Jez is 6'3" or something and looking up and then turning in when I finished.
In the event, Jez Wilkins' statement didn't support Gerry McCann's recollection of that much analysed moment. Neither Jez Wilkins or Gerry McCann saw Jane Tanner despite the road being fairly narrow, and if Gerry McCann had been facing the way that Jane Tanner had claimed, surely he would have also seen the alleged abductor, but he didn't. Nonetheless, Jane Tanner's e-fit of a man became the primary e-fit for 5 years until Operation Grange eliminated it. But many people, including the Portuguese police, dismissed Tanner's sighting.
And given the environment, how much detail would you really see?
Unsurprisingly, these account disparities and others are why the police have sought reconstructions from the McCanns and their friends, but in 10 years, that has not happened.
You have to understand there will be inconsistencies, but there are some pretty major inconsistencies of fact in the witness statements that we've got and that we see. You know, and this case is unusual because there is so much information in the public domain that's been put online by the Portuguese authorities that you know, a million amateur sleuths can read it and come up with their ideas, and in some ways that adds fuel to the fire of the speculation from both ends of the spectrum. But you know, from what I know of the information that's about, there are inconsistencies which I'd like to try and iron out. One way to do that would actually be the cooperation of the witnesses to come to a reconstruction, to allow it to be maybe filmed and to see, you know, and you can stop that as you're going on and say, hang on a minute, no, because you're saying that, so that can't be right, can it? Let's think about that again. And you kind of get a composite story that's closer to the truth.
So, back to that political involvement I touched upon earlier. From 2007 to present day, the McCanns have enjoyed unprecedented support from 4 British Prime Ministers, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, to the current Prime Minister Theresa May, who has continued the multi-million-pound spend of Operation Grange. These actions of such high-level political intervention and support has left professionals baffled.
One of the most peculiar things about this case is the government involvement to the level it has been involved. Now, there are many cases which occur around the world when a person from one country goes missing in another, where there is some government involvement. I don't think that just because the government stepped in some ways that this is necessarily something we should question. However, the level of support that the McCanns have gotten is shocking. I can't even come up with a decent explanation for it, except that something is amiss. I have never seen that much money be thrown at a case, which to me, a case that really doesn't deserve that kind of money. The case was well investigated.
2016, I had a series of email exchanges with then British Prime Minister David Cameron's office. I questioned the multi-million-pound spend he had approved on the case. I offered to share all my research with his office. It was not taken up. David Cameron, following Britain's vote to leave the EU in June 2016, left office 1 week after my final exchange with his spin doctor.
As of March 2018, Operation Grange has been granted a further undisclosed sum from the British government. The Home Office refused to confirm to me how much this was or how long it was intended to last for. What we do know is the amount hovers around the £12 million mark. Despite this, and at a time of national austerity, government ministers in Theresa May's cabinet refused to be drawn on this.
People about Operation Grange, the investigation into Madeleine McCann. Do you believe she was abducted?
Oh, I think leave that to the professionals. I don't believe
really? You don't have an opinion?
I don't speak on issues that I'm not really qualified to talk about.
Do you believe that we should have spent £12 million as a country for one child, when one child goes missing every 5 minutes?
So we're really in a hurry.
So am I, but this is an important question. Ministers need to answer this, actually. Do you believe it's acceptable for the British public to have spent £12 million on that operation to shortly close it? Do you believe that Madeleine was abducted?
As a result of my questioning MPs, police from the Houses of Parliament were sent out to question me.
Many of the MPs are only asked questions inside the box, and I believe that they are accountable to the people, and as long as I approach them in the correct way, which I always do, then I have the right to ask some questions, and that's sort of my bottom line, really.
Right. Give an explanation, that's perfectly reasonable, you know. So, you know what you're doing, and that's it.
On the day that further funding for Operation Grange was announced, I was invited to discuss it on a national radio breakfast show. Based on the public announcements of Operation Grange, I told the presenter that the McCanns and their friends had not been part of the investigation. He refused to believe me. After the broadcast, I contacted Operation Grange to double-check the position and was informed that, yes, what I had said was accurate until further notice or until this changes.
Not gone back to ground zero, and perhaps that is the last line of inquiry.
But the reality is, who knows what's going on in a police investigation other than the officers involved? Since when have the police thrown investigation details open to the public to dissect? And this case is no different, is it? Could it yet be that the investigation will surprise many, or will Operation Grange, criticised by police and public alike, end without a conclusion or without having gone back to the start? Retired detective Colin Sutton is in no doubt about what needs to happen with the remaining money.
The starting point has got to be back at ground zero, this is when the report was made. These were the last people to see her. This is what they say. These are the people close to her. Let's eliminate those. Let's get them out of the way. And that would serve everybody. That would be in the interests of both the general public, but also Kate and Gerry McCann. Because there's an awful lot of tittle-tattle on the internet and rumours, and this is a case which has aroused so many opinions, and quite strong opinions in some cases. If you comprehensively, conclusively, forensically eliminate Gerry and Kate McCann and their friends from any involvement, then that squashes almost all of that rumour mill. That takes it all away.
As a journalist, it is my responsibility to present pertinent questions, particularly of public interest, and so in the years since Madeleine's disappearance, I have sought to interview the McCanns both directly and via their press spokesman Clarence Mitchell. But it wasn't to be. And it wasn't to be because, in my experience, interviews are not granted if the abduction theory is subject to question.
As for the Portuguese police, Madeleine's disappearance remains a unique and random event.
Hello, do you speak English? Oh, well, I bet it's better than my Portuguese.
I'm a journalist from England and I'm looking for some statistics and facts. I'm looking where I might be able to acquire some information of how many foreign national children have gone missing in the last 10 years. And I tell you why I asked this. I'm making a documentary called The Untold Stories.
I'm going to tell you one statistic.
Go on.
Na Praia da Luz?
Yes.
None. The first and the last.